Church, we are rounding out the book of Galatians in chapter 6 here. And I think we had some really good discussion in chapter 5 this past Sunday. But we're not just wrapping up chapter 6, but we're also wrapping up the entire letter to the Galatians, which so far has been just incredibly inspiring, and it always is every time I go through this book. But so I'm going to just do a little rehash, just a recap. Chapter 1, Paul, he gives us confirmation of the authenticity of the gospel of Christ and forewarns us and tells the Galatian church and says, basically beware of the fakers, of anybody with a fake gospel, anything that is different than what was preached in the eyewitness testimony of Christ's life, and says not to get fooled by something different than that. Now, chapter 2, he goes on and he reiterates this in basically saying, hey, there's some bootleg gospel stuff out there, given the context of the letter to the Galatians, of the fact that they were trying to uphold the law and some of the tradition that they held to prior to coming to Jesus. And so he emphatically tells us that, that we're justified by faith and not by law or procedure or by deeds or anything like that. And he moves into chapter 3 because the Galatian church was struggling with this. They had some people that had fallen into this and goes, man, who fooled you guys? Who made fools of you? And, you've fallen for the very basic bottom line bootleg gospel that's not of any value. And it's definitely not true. But chapter 4, he goes in and reiterates and says, listen, it's again, we were declared righteous and justified according to our faith and not to anything that we've done or did or don't do. And likens that to being sons and daughters and heirs to a kingdom, to what Christ has for us. And so that it was such just an encouraging chapter. It's just so amazing. And then, and shows like in contrast to what there is available to us in trying to keep up with the law or keep up with some tradition versus believing what Christ has done for us. And then last week in chapter 5, the theme is about the freedom that we have in that we're free from law and from tradition and from procedure and from checklists and all this stuff that when we are living according to the Spirit and led by the Spirit, instead of trying to adhere to the law or some tradition or something along those lines, something false that the gospel is not about, that bears fruit. And that fruit is obviously the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, honor, self-control, everything that we read in chapter 5. But that the fruit of us trying to do anything out of ourselves, trying to be righteous out of ourselves, produces a whole lot of bad stuff, malice and envy and nothing good. And it just, because it all becomes a work of the flesh. And so he tells us this as we get free from the junk that we had and we come into the freedom of the Spirit that we now have, that it's not about striving to do or to be something, the fruits of the Spirit, but that is the byproduct or the end result of what happens when we have that faith and we come into that level of righteousness and being justified by what Christ did. All we have to do is believe it, and our lives begin producing that fruit. So we don't have to chase what the result is. We don't have to chase peace and patience and goodness and faithfulness and self-control. We don't have to chase that. All we have to do is chase Jesus, and then those come as a result. So we get into chapter 6 and he wraps it up. And he starts his chapter here by saying, verse 1, brothers, if anyone is caught in transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourselves, lest you too be tempted. And I love this because the thing is that he gives us the warning in chapter 1, reminds us in chapter 2, shows us the error in chapter 3, and then he gives us that restoring word in chapter 4. And then we see what that looks like in chapter 5. And so he doesn't just leave it like, oh, well, you guys are messing up and you've been messing up, and so there's just no hope for you or anything like that. No, he says, so when you find yourself in that place, not if, but when, and when we find each other in that place, the first thing he does is says that there's restoration available to us and that we have a real opportunity to respond and to correct and to restore ourselves and the people around us in gentleness. And again, that's one of the things that, right, it's like a qualifying factor. Like if you read into this and you look at it, it's like, well, don't just do it to be doing it. You should be in such a way, those of us who are spiritual, in such a way that that if we're experiencing the Spirit according to what we believe and having faith, then the fruit, our life should look like, and one of the things is gentleness. And we should have that, and we should be approaching and correcting and restoring each other in that. So it's really an opportunity. It's really great. And if we don't have any business correcting anybody. That's one of those things, right? We have an opportunity to pull the log out of our own eye before we begin trying to pull the speck out of our brother's eye. But let's get into verse 2 here. He says, bear one another's burdens and fulfill the law of Christ. So we get to restore each other gently, in gentleness, and with having good, clear boundaries so we don't get caught up in the same snare. And bear one another's burdens. So when we come alongside and we help our brother or our sister, the great thing about this is that he says it's not all for naught, but there's a purpose. What's the purpose in doing this? And he tells us here in verse 2, he says that the law of Christ is fulfilled. That the law of Christ is fulfilled. So where do we find that? What is the law of Christ? We talk about doing away with the law and, no longer adhering to the law, but Jesus did tell us, he gave us the commandment. We find that in Matthew 22, I think it's 36 through 40. And I know for a fact in John chapter 12, he tells us this, and it's 30, 34, 35, 36, something right around those verses there. So Matthew 22 and John chapter 12. And I want you guys to look at that and examine that, exactly what it is that Christ is telling us to do. And that he tells us that by doing this, that when we bear one another's burdens, we fulfill that law of Christ mentioned in Matthew and in John. So we're going to go down here, let's take a look at verse 6. He says, let the one who is taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. I absolutely, positively, beyond the shadow of a doubt, love this right here. He says, let the one who is taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. And what he's talking about, the direction that he's given us, or the instruction that he's given us, is that we have this great opportunity when you're in a position of influencing, or you're in a position of teaching or of authority. And newsflash, you don't have to be an ordained pastor or anything to be in that, right? When you carry the Spirit of God with you, you are now qualified in that. The world looks at you. Other believers look at you. People who are older, people who are younger, people who are not as far along in their walk as you. They look at you and they examine what you're about and what you're doing. And so we always have this opportunity, whether it's in word or it's in action, to be teaching and showing and demonstrating that life that is producing the fruit of the Spirit. And so what this is not just And for those of us on the other side of the stick, it's not about just, hey, I'm just going to sit and listen to what you have to teach or what you have to say or what you have to show me or whatever. He says very clearly here, he says, let the one who is taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. This is an encouraging thing. This is a discipleship type of relationship. This is right here. He's telling the Galatians, like, hey, part of the restoration process of coming out of false doctrine and out of falsehood and out of this overbearing law thing, out of anything that's not according to the gospel or living by the Spirit, part of this is a discipleship relationship. To be able to hear back the good things that you say or that you do to the people around you, because that is the Holy Spirit permeating, right? And sometimes even those of us who teach, we get discouraged. We're like, man, does anybody hear anything I'm saying? Can anybody understand exactly what the word is telling me? Like, I get it, I'm so excited about it, and I just want to share it with everybody, only be met by a blank stare. It's good to hear it back. Yeah, you've heard it. 2, you've applied it. And this is what it means to you. And this is how you're carrying that thing forward. It's really good. I love this. That this is part of edification, but it's also in context here. What he's talking about is that this is part of restoration, of restoring our brother who may be caught up in stuff. Because I'm here to tell you, not all of us have it all together. Not all of us think exactly 100% the way that we should every time about everything. We always have room for correction and encouragement. So this is a process. This is one of the things he gives us, and I love this. I really, really love this. When we look at this is what Proverbs 27:17 is talking about. This is exactly the iron sharpening the iron thing. So I'm going to jump down. I want to share just a couple more things with you guys. We're going to go to verse 8, and I want you to look at this. For the one who sows his own flesh will, from the flesh, reap corruption. But the one who sows the Spirit will, from the Spirit, reap eternal life. And if we had to sum up the whole book, if we had to sum up this whole chapter, the chapter before it, this is exactly what he's talking about. If we go all the way back to chapter 1 and we look and we go, hey, we got caught up in false doctrine. We got caught up in, in order to be righteous or holy, you have to wear a tie to church or something like that. Other than that, your salvation can't be complete. Some garbage like that. Something crazy. We get caught up and we get fixated on that stuff, right? Then what happens is as we follow the law, we follow procedure, we try and check off a checklist. I went to church, I wore a tie, I did this, I gave so much money, whatever the case is, I helped somebody I didn't want to help, just begrudgingly or whatever, just to check something off the list. He clearly tells us here that the fruit of that is exactly what we read about in chapter 5. It becomes like dissension, and it becomes envy, and it becomes all this stuff that is the fruit of the flesh versus the fruit of the Spirit. And he reiterates here that when we have faith and we live and we do according to that faith, that our life begins to produce all of those cool things, man. The gentleness, the kindness, the self-control, right? The goodness, the faithfulness. It's life being led in the Spirit. So, so he goes on, and even last week in chapter 5, it wasn't just about coming into the Spirit, but the second piece of this is about keeping in step with the Spirit. Once you get that momentum, to not let that momentum go, because as soon as we do, the default is the flesh. And, and one day I'm going to do some teaching on that, so that we can understand that. Because, see, like, my flesh is thick, it's girthy, because my flesh is lazy. And so if I'm not motivated to do something, I will default of doing nothing. And nothing good is produced from that. But as I'm motivated and inspired and driven by the Spirit, then my life, the Spirit in me, begins to produce good things, really good things. But as soon as I stop keeping in step with that and let that go, it's like going, well, I'm going to cut my hair one time. I'm going to trim my beard down one time and it'll stay looking good until I meet Jesus. No, it's not like that. We have to keep in step with that thing and keep it up. And our spiritual life is the same. And this is what he's getting at here in chapter 6 that, hey, it's not about just believing the one time, but it's about this perpetual belief. And we don't have to do anything. It's not about, it's not like, oh, well, I gave this for this amount of time or this amount of money and now I'm good forever. Well, no, man. It's not that. It's not we have to continue and we have to stay in step with that. So let's jump down here and I'm going to wrap this up in verse 16. I'm going to hold my Bible up a little bit because I'm still old school. I like it on the paper here. Don't get me wrong. I love technology, but just something about the word of God on paper. But we're going to wrap this up here in verse 16. It says, as for all who walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God. It says, for all who walk by this rule. So we'll back it up to verse 15 here. It says, for neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but a new creation. So if we walk by that rule where we go, man, it doesn't matter what we do, what procedure we keep in step with, or what we don't do, but we become a new creation when we die to the flesh. And he said that in chapter 2, right? I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live. Like, it's about killing those fleshly desires, the default to be lazy, to be greedy, right? To be drunken, to be envious, to be all of that stuff, to crucify that. And I no longer live, but the life I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And when we believe that, we receive the Spirit, we begin living according to the Spirit. We keep in step with the Spirit, so we keep that up in the Spirit. And he says, and that's it. So then it doesn't matter. It's not about what we do or what we don't do or what we've ever done or what we ever will do, but it's about what we believe and who we believe that Christ is and who we believe that he says that we are, and that our lives produce this fruit. And he says, so if we just do this as a rule, right? As for all who walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them. When we have a life full of goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and kindness and self-control, the reward we reap from that is certainly a life of peace and mercy. So I look forward to seeing and talking with you guys all on Sunday on the Zoom call. And like I say, if for whatever reason when you get this email and you get the link to this video that you don't have the link for the Zoom call, please email us and we'll make sure that you get it, because I look forward to diving in and looking at this. There'll be questions here in the email and everything for you guys to look at. And I just want to tear this thing apart and live this with you guys. Typically I'm the one who teaches, but I want to be encouraged and hear back from the ones who are taught. Man, I love you guys.